So you may just have heard today's story somewhere before. Luke chapter 2. In those days, a decree went out from the Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration, and it was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David, called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child, and she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in bands of cloth, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. Okay, spot the difference between these two first lines of Christmas carols or Christmas songs. The first one is this: long time ago in Bethlehem, so the Holy Bible says. That's the first one. And the second one is this: O little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie. You might be relieved that I've chosen to speak them rather than sing them. Well, of course, there are lots of differences between them, but the one I want to notice is this, that sometimes when we reflect on, when we try to express our understanding of the Christmas story, the emphasis is on how long ago it happened, how far away, how distant from our current circumstances. Of course, that's an important element of understanding the Christmas story. What was the world like back then, which was so different from the world we know? The second carol, first line of a carol, and like many of our carols and ways of trying to express the Christmas story, takes a different route and uses the power of imagination to put us in the place of the Christmas story, to bring it close to us. A little town of Bethlehem, how still we see thee lie, as if we're there and we're watching, we're part of the scene and we're engaging with it directly or very closely. It seems to me there are those two different ways of embracing the Christmas story. The latter one, I think, is the more natural one, and the one that maybe feeds us best. That sense of bringing either taking us back into the time of the Christmas story, or to bring the Christmas story into our own immediate experience. And many Christmas nativity plays will try and do precisely that, rather than worrying about the exact historical details of how we might reenact that ancient story from such a foreign world, but to bring it into our own time. And maybe you've seen in the news or on social media one of my favourite from this particular season of nativity recorded by and for the children and the families of Grasmere in Cumbria, the Grasmere Nativity. You can Google it if you haven't yet seen it. And quite delightfully and wonderfully, the children and some adults bringing the story to life in their own place in rural Cumbria, with sheep farmers and mountain rescue teams and even a yoga group on the shore of Grasmere. And what a great thing, what a good thing to do to bring the story close. Well, I say all that because it seems to me that as we read Luke and try to read it afresh, this such familiar story, and I'm not going beyond the first 3 words of the passage today, Luke begins with a clear signal of that sense of what do we do with that time span. He says, in those days. In those days. And of course, it's quite a vague expression, simply a storyteller's tool to introduce to us a story, but it flags up something important, that Luke has a sense of distance from the story that he's telling. If we use that phrase, in those days, there's something in us that is saying, and those days were different. That what I'm about to say will demand of you, at the very least, to exercise your imaginations to get back into that place. If I was talking to some primary school children today, maybe I might say, in those days, the height of technology for us, when I was your age, was to have a little square box of tricks in our hand, electronic tricks in our hand, and it was an 8-digit calculator which could do addition, multiplication, subtraction, and division. And if you knew the right number and keyed it in and turned it upside down, you could spell shell or Esso. That was the height of technology in those days. And any primary school child today would need a leap of imagination to get back into those days. And of course, there's something else that Luke is implying in just those 3 short words, that although he's referencing a time in the past, he is talking to a community of believers now for whom the world is different. He needs to tell them, as opposed to these days, in those days, this is what things were like. Now, Luke doesn't really flesh that out, and it's a passing comment. It's merely a storyteller's tool. But I wonder if we can draw 3 things out of that I suspect Luke was acutely aware were different in those days. And so you could imagine Luke maybe expanding that and saying, in those days, it seemed to all and sundry that the emperor in Rome, Augustus, was in charge of things, and that what he said went, and the entire human population had to move at his behest and his behest alone. That the emperor is in charge of all those things. In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus. We might also infer from what Luke says that he has, at least in his heart, if he's not actually given voice to this, the idea that in those days, to talk about God's work of salvation being worked out, it had to be through the story of Israel and the story of David and his descendants. In those days, it was so hard to imagine that God's purposes for Israel would be worked out in any other way than through the story of David and his ancestors, his descendants. Maybe a third one. That in those days, to talk of Jesus was really to talk of nothing more than what you might call a prophetic sign. A child in a manger. An anomaly, a curious, incongruous bringing together of things. A baby child in the feeding trough of an animal. And as in so many prophetic signs, it is that bringing together the incongruous to show that something different is here. But that's the beginning and end of it. That's all that Luke tells us about the Christmas story, that a child was laid in a manger, and then later, of course, the shepherds will be told that's the sign that something is happening. And so again, I know we're inferring a lot from 3 short words, but to the implied audience, to those, that faith community to whom Luke is telling this story, though in those days it was like that, what is it like in these days? In these days, we have a different understanding of what it means to talk about kingdoms and empires and kings and those who are really in charge. And it's God's kingdom that really counts. In these days, I'm quite sure Luke is inferring, we know that God's salvation purposes go beyond the story of Israel and the descendants of David, but are inclusive, of course, also of the Gentile world. In these days, things are different. And in these days, we are not restricted merely to that peculiar sign of a child in a manger, that incongruity of things, but we know the fullness of who Jesus is as the Son of God, the one who brings that story of salvation to life. In these days, we now know. I'm very aware as we approach this particular Christmas, there is a very real sense of these being very peculiar days. Since last March, we've been talking about a new normal. It's become part of our regular jargon. We know that there is something very specific, very world-changing, very life-changing, and very faith-changing about the times, the days through which we are living now. And I wonder, therefore, what those words of Luke in those days might say to us. And to take the middle of those 3 points that I infer that Luke might be suggesting, that's that question of, well, who is included in this story of salvation that the Christmas story is at the heart of? Who is included? Because to me that's been one of the most pressing and urgent questions as we've gone through our various periods of lockdown and restrictions and having to find new and creative way to do things. It has raised all the way along the line that question of inclusion and exclusion. As we celebrate Christmas through our church life and we do things differently, I think in many instances we will find that our audiences, our congregations will be rather different from how they would have been last year and maybe will next year. We are engaging differently with each other and with different elements of our communities and society. And it raises that question, who is this story for? And maybe not just for the usual suspects, and surely that's part of Luke's meaning and his telling of the Christmas story. In those days, it was like this, and it seemed that the story of God's salvation was restricted to the story of the descendants of David. In these days, as we know Jesus in his fullness, we are constantly having to rethink who is included in this story of salvation. With whom do we share this journey of hope and expectation? And where is God leading us in new ways?